Bien, we have some time for dialogue, question, response. Qiao, you concluded in not excluding the fact that we could have a total collapse of global governance, if I understand well. I guess that it was more or less in the working assumption that we could not engineer appropriate peace, and that all the tensions that we are observing at the level of geostrategy would not be solved. Am I right to make that working assumption?
Sure.
That it is geostrategy that would engineer this collapse of global governance that you are mentioning?
Yeah, I hope the international community can recognize these dangers. Then they can make a great effort to solve the challenge. Otherwise, I do worry about the future.
Let me check on the colleagues another assumption, say. We say that the geostrategic enormous difficulty that we have presently would be appeased progressively, and that it would not be the dominant influence on the global economy and global finance, and that we could engineer a better representation in the Bretton Woods institution of those emerging economies and developing economies that are more or less pushed down by the traditional European, Japan, and the US. Say that we have a better functioning, a better representation in the Bretton Woods institution. Do you trust that that is pretty possible? Taking into account all the resistance that we see, and that then we would be, of course, in a better world where the idea of having a counter system, constellation of institutions would appear not to be reasonable. John, I see that you have a body language. What would you respond to this question?
Yes. First of all, as I suspect that in this audience everyone is aware, constitutionally, in other words, within the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund, there is a requirement that at least every 5 years there is a reassessment of the voting shares in the institution. And as I suspect everyone here knows, the articles say that the voting shares should be based on economic weight. Unfortunately, the concept is not defined, so it's left in negotiation. But it's obviously very clear that a big change was negotiated at the Seoul G20 summit in November 2010 that would make a substantial change in increasing the share of dynamic emerging developing economies in their voting share. That was a partial change. It was very hard to engineer because, of course, it's a zero-sum issue. If some gain, some lose. And the big loser is obvious, among other things, the European countries that have been overrepresented. There has been, at that time, in Seoul, 2010, there was a commitment to not only adopt the changes then, but to undertake a relatively rapid reassessment of voting shares, in which it was understood there would be further increase, among other things, in the share of China and others. That second round, which was supposed to have happened within a couple years, 2010, still has not happened. And so it's important that the atmosphere of cooperation on all sides needs to be improved so that can move forward. And if I could just say, an area where there is a problem and an emerging problem. An existing problem has been the breakdown in the pre-existing Paris Club mechanism for renegotiating debt of basically developing economies. And since the huge increase in the lending by new lenders in new forms since the global financial crisis, that system of renegotiation has not been working at all well. And it's important that there be improved cooperation to make the, you could use the phrase, the G20's common framework for debt treatments to become effectively operational. This is important because, as we've heard already this morning, that the latest developments, latest round of post-Ukraine strains has increased the debt pressure on many developing economies, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So progress is needed. The third, of course, has been the reemergence of global imbalances in trade. Not only has trade grown more slowly, but imbalances are reappearing. It's quite possible that China is going to have a current surplus of in excess of $1 trillion this year. The export performance of China has been very dynamic in the last year. That had given, in the past, has given rise to frictions. So it's clear that there's need to be a greater sense of cooperation to address these issues on all sides.
Thank you very much, John. Thinking of global imbalances, Gabriel has something to say, but I have a question for him. When you presented exports and imports, we could have had the current account, and then we could have compared the current account of the US and the current account of Europe, and then you would have something like -3 or more % of the GDP on one side of the Atlantic and plus on the other side of the Atlantic. How would you qualify this permanent situation of surplus on the one hand and deficit in the US?
So, thank you. But this is something we have observed for a long time now, and it's somehow it's not standing in the way of growth and of collaboration, because we have seen the same signs, more or less the same quantities for a long time.
Is it sustainable in the long run?
Yes. So that's the big question.
Another question.
It was sustainable for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I think it is not sustainable in the sense that what it means for Europe is that we have a large excess of savings over investments. And that is certainly not sustainable, no? From a European point of view. And while for the United States, this has been since the 70s, more or less, no? And it looks like it's connected to the role of the dollar, which might see challenges in the very long run, no? So the fact that I don't know whether it is completely true, but the fact that Russian oil exports to India, at least partially, are now invoiced in renminbi. No? So these changes might make it difficult to maintain the large deficit position of the United States in the very long run. But I wanted to say something about John's observation on zero sum. Right? It's of course, if you change the voting shares at the IMF, or if you change the rules, there is this notion that there's always a loser and a winner, and that is of course very true. But it does depend on what is our baseline. Now, if the baseline is the status quo, making changes leads to losers and winners. But if the baseline is the multilateral system or the global governance system being destroyed or becoming dysfunctional, then it is again a positive sum exercise to work together to make the system work and continue to work. No? So I think this is an important question of perspective. Now, what are we comparing with? And another remark that I wanted to make is we often talk about big power competition now. No? And I'm an economist, and I was brought up with the idea that competition, sometimes at least, no, it can be positive. It can be something that gives rise to new ideas, and maybe that is a little bit of a positive side of it. No, that for example, in climate change, Europeans have opted for taxes or carbon prices. The United States is going a different way. Now that is making our lives difficult. No? It creates questions of competitiveness and so on. But it is also a way of understanding how different approaches work. And if we see the American approach is better, then we might come back and say, let's correct our European stance. And vice versa. No? If it becomes incredibly expensive for the United States, they might want to learn from us. So this idea of competition that makes life difficult, but it is possibly also a source of inspiration, of innovation, of new ideas.
Thank you very much indeed. I share your view. Please, Qiao.
Yeah, I'm going to just add something regarding the voting power at the IMF. I agree with both John and you mentioned that. Actually, since 1910, nothing changing on the evaluation of quarter. I guess last time is 16 general evaluation. But what I try to say, not China, even India, less representative. Both of them make a compromise because last time, just every member of IMF increased their funding by 50%, but the structure, no change. That's something actually China and India and the South, Global South made a compromise, just want to keep the IMF have enough funding. That's something I guess in the future, both sides, advanced country and the developing country should do more in cooperation. These kind of things cannot always forever existing. Otherwise, the legitimacy of IMF will be reduced. That's my point.
Thank you for this remark, which is very important. I see that you have the...
Yes, I'd like to say something as a former IMF staffer to complement the discussion on quotas and voting powers in the executive board. What is very striking, if I compare the IMF today to what it was 30 years ago when I worked there, is the number of Chinese experts working in the IMF staff and Indian experts. We now have the second Indian chief economist at the IMF, Mrs. Gopinath. We had Raghu Rajan already 20 years ago. So I think from the inside of the institution, both China and India are having a much more influence than in the past, even if in terms of voting powers in the board, things are moving more and more slowly. And then I would add that for the OECD, which used to be known as the Club of Rich Countries, as you will recall, the OECD was created under the name OEEC after the Second World War to administer the Marshall Plan and then reinvented itself with a new name. And it had only 18, indeed mostly rich member countries at the time, but since then we've expanded and we are now 38 member countries, many of which are emerging markets. And we engage very actively with the BRICS, except for Russia these days. And we have 8 important EMEs as accession countries, including Brazil and Argentina and Thailand and Indonesia. So we are seeking to give more of a voice to the other countries that matter increasingly on the world scene. And here's the win-win. There's nobody's losing, on the contrary.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. Jean-Marie, do you have anything to say on this particular point?
We work on consensus as a WTO, so it's already balanced.
If I may, picking up what has been said on the currencies, clearly the dollar has no particular statutes. We exploded the Bretton Woods system, and so it is the free choice of the I would say economic agents, investors and savers and traders to pick up the dollar as a currency which is utilized 3 times more than the euro, if I may, which is second, and much more than the renminbi, even if there are some kind of, I would say, growing trade denominated in renminbi. But it is clear that this is due mainly, it seems to me, to the fact that the United States is a full-fledged political federation. There is one treasury, not a dozen like in Europe. And if I take the euro as a currency and the dollar as a currency, I don't see enormous difference between their capacity to keep their value, to be stable, to inspire confidence. At certain moment, the euro inspired more confidence than the US dollar. So the problem is that the signature, which is on the bills or the bonds, is single in one case, and you have the German Bund, you have the OAT, you have the Italian Treasury, and the, I would say, depth and liquidity of this benchmark market is in the proportion of 1 to 10 or 1 to 15. And that makes, of course, a great part of the difference. And the renminbi is not yet convertible. The day the renminbi becomes convertible, yes, you change the structure exactly like if the European were a political federation. But we will see what happens. In the century, a lot of things can happen, probably.